Trust, head to news.abc.net.au or the ABC News app.
Today, the government defends travel restrictions from China, saying there's a lack of COVID transparency. Authorities plead for people to take caution in waterways after a spate of drownings. Brazilians lined the streets to celebrate the inauguration of a new president. And Australia's United Cup hopes suffer from an injury-plagued start to the tennis season. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Dan Borsche, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Travellers arriving from China will have to test negative for COVID-19 before being allowed into Australia from Thursday. Australia joins countries including the United States, the United Kingdom and France in imposing the measures which China has criticised, even though currently they require a negative test for all arrivals. The Health Minister says he's taken the move out of an abundance of caution, with fears Beijing is not being clear about the extent of the outbreak. Political reporter Dana Morse joins us now from Parliament House. Dana, what can you tell us?
Good afternoon, Dan. Well, the concerns around what Beijing is not being transparent about comes from this idea that there could potentially be new variants circulating among the population there, because up until very recently, China had COVID zero policies in place. They abandoned those policies just over a month ago and are now in the grips of an Omicron wave. If you think back to the beginning of 2022 last year, Australia was in the grips of a similar wave. So that's sort of what they're going through, but with a much denser population, with some experts suggesting that up to 40% of the country could potentially have been infected in this current wave. With such high transmission, new variants are likely to pop up, and around the international community we have seen new variants and sub-variant strains of the Omicron variant, but none has come forward so far that has superseded the Omicron variant. That's the information that currently China is not sharing with the international community. The WHO, the World Health Organization, had meetings with Chinese officials recently where they asked for China to provide real-time and up-to-date data on the situation that is evolving there, but we're yet to see any changes come through from that. So that's some of the reasoning behind the federal government here in Australia saying they will require a negative test 48 hours prior to departure for all travellers arriving in the country from China, despite the fact that we have COVID circulating widely here. The federal opposition has been broadly supportive of the policy so far, but they say they want the government to release the health advice behind informing that decision. But let's take a listen now to the Health Minister, Mark Butler, speaking earlier this morning.
We think it's a modest, balanced decision, in addition to a range of measures that we're going to put in place. For example, wastewater screening of airplanes that arrive from China will ensure we get that sort of information that the World Health Organization has said is at the moment quite absent. I think that point just reflects the fact that we have a very clear line of sight about what's happening in the US and countries across the world for that matter. As I said, that genomic sequencing is uploaded pretty much in real time, so we do know what variants are emerging around the rest of the world.
Health Minister Mark Butler there talking about the need for more information about the COVID wave currently sweeping across China. Business groups here in Australia have been critical of the changes because they were hoping when China opened its international borders, which is happening on January the 8th, that there would be an influx of both tourists and university students that would have helped prop up several sectors during difficult economic times. But the federal government is standing firm, saying it needs to balance the risk of a potential new variant being introduced into Australia.
Dana, in other news, Indigenous Australians Minister Linda Burney has flagged a referendum on the voice to Parliament could be held as early as August. The opposition, though, is still calling for more detail before it declares a position. So what detail has been released? Can we expect a more concrete plan before this vote goes ahead?
Yeah, so this comes from an interview that Linda Burney did with the Sydney Morning Herald, where she said that the legislation behind a voice would be introduced into the Parliament either in February or March. Now, from there, previous referendums dictate that a referendum can be held within 2 to 6 months. So that's where that August figure, August estimation of a date is coming in. It's not been confirmed by the government whether that's where they're aiming to have the referendum or not. But looking at that detail argument again, this has been a ploy from the opposition since the Garma Festival, where the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, released the draft question behind the voice to Parliament. And critics are saying that the opposition is pretty blatantly playing politics with this issue, because there are two pretty significant reports that are informing the voice to Parliament, one being the Lisa Dodson report and one being the Calma-Langton report. Both were tabled to the Cabinet when the Morrison and Turnbull governments were in power, but they decided not to proceed or move forward with the voice to Parliament. So that detail is there. It's also available to the public, though it's not particularly consumable for the public. But the government says what it wants is for the Australian people to vote on the principle of the voice, that they want to ask if there should be a voice to Parliament or not, and not really bog this debate down in a lot of detail, because, of course, in 1999, when we had our last referendum, which was the referendum whether Australia should become a republic or not, essentially the debate got very muddied between whether we should be a republic or not and what sort of republic model they would like to choose. So that's what the government is aiming to avoid here. However, we should expect that there will be some more detail that will come forward. We expect that a launch of a campaign will happen in the next month to 6 weeks or so. And Uluru Statement advocates say that this is going to be a steady build and the timeline is plenty long enough, even if a vote does happen as early as August. Let's take a listen to Professor Megan Davis now, speaking earlier this morning.
What the voice looks like in terms of the bricks and mortar, well, that's not put into the Constitution. That's dealt with the Parliament like it normally does in a very supervised process that comes after the referendum. And so what the government will put out will be a combination of process, so what does design look like if the referendum gets up, and principles. And what the government will do is draw from 3 very important reports that have been written since Uluru.
Professor Megan Davis there, talking about the importance for the Parliament to retain the legislative power on the detail behind the voice and for the Australian people to be voting on the principle. Dan?
Dana Morse reporting from Parliament. Residents in parts of Menindee in far west New South Wales have been dealing with rising floodwaters for days, and it looks like the peak will be today. An emergency evacuation warning remains in place, with locals working to reinforce levees. Reporter Ben Loughran joins me from Menindee. Ben, what can you tell us?
G'day. Well, right now in town, the RFS, the police and the SES are out in force helping people pack up. So far, there's been about a dozen properties that actually have been affected by the floodwaters, with a further 30 to 35 that are currently being watched. Last night throughout town, well, not throughout town, in major areas, there were some levees that were breached that had to lead to around 100 head of livestock being rescued early this morning. Elsewhere, paddocks are being sort of flooded and people are dealing with that. Right now, unfortunately, people are still having to build levees, fill sandbags and try and protect their properties in those affected areas as best they can. As you can probably tell, it's very, very hot today, and it has been over the weekend, so it has been back-breaking work in many ways. Around town, that's essentially what's happening as the water continues to rise, will potentially continue to rise, I should say, over the next couple of days.
Ben, given those conditions and that work, how are residents holding up?
Right now, residents, to say they're frustrated is probably a bit of an understatement. This all started when they felt that this evacuation order was more or less sprung on them. It went from 9.6 to 10.7. This was the predicted river level, the Darling River, in the space of about 24 hours, and they were given what amounted to about 3 days to pack up everything and go. Like I said, yes, it has been very, very hot. Residents in the affected areas and people who have already lost properties have spent the days before now just building levees, having their community members and their neighbours help them out, try and move furniture and basically relocate to a makeshift home for the next couple of days while their property is effectively affected by the flooding. So right now in town, residents are banding together, it must be said. It's been fantastic to see around town just people saying, let me help. How do I help? I'll get the excavator out. I'll help you move furniture. It really has been a sight to behold in many ways.
And given that tremendous increase in water, where's it all coming from?
So this is what the issue is right now, is that 4 days ago, when the evacuation order was issued on Thursday, they said that the reason that it was such a shock is because the Tallywalker Creek, I say creek, it's around 100 kilometres long and it runs sort of adjacent to the Darling River, that had so much water that it breached its banks and flowed back into the Darling, which it doesn't usually do. And by doing that, it bypassed the Wilcannia Gauge. And the Wilcannia Gauge is the only gauge between here and the lake system and river that runs through Menindee. So as the water seeped in through the Tallywalker into the Darling River, essentially there was no idea how much water was going to introduce itself into the system and pass through. So right now the river is sort of sitting at around 10.3. There is the thought it may go up to 10.7. It's being watched right now. But like you said, it is believed to have hit its peak today, but SES and Water New South Wales are just monitoring the situation closely.
Ben Loughran reporting from Menindee. The body of a man who drowned while swimming northeast of Melbourne has been found. The 34-year-old man was swimming with friends in Lake Eildon when he got into difficulty and failed to resurface yesterday afternoon. A search resumed today and the man's body was found in the water this morning. Meanwhile, an off-duty police officer is drowned at an unpatrolled beach on the New South Wales south coast yesterday while rescuing 2 children. Reporter Ariana Levy has more from Sydney.
Details are emerging of the bravery of a man who had attempted to rescue 2 children yesterday afternoon on the state's south coast when he himself unfortunately drowned. The man in his 40s is believed to have entered the water at Handkerchief Beach, just south of Narooma, to rescue 2 teenage boys aged 12 and 15 when he himself unfortunately was caught in a rip and dragged out to sea. Now, at about 1:30 p.m. yesterday afternoon, surf lifesavers had deployed a rescue boat to the man's location in the water, and when they brought him back to shore, he was unfortunately unable to be revived. It's believed the man was an off-duty police officer on holiday with his family. Now, these spates of tragic drownings across the country has prompted Royal Surf Lifesaving Australia to issue an urgent call to swimmers to be extra cautious this summer period. In total, there have been 23 drownings across the country since the start of December. They say that people who frequent holiday areas and say they know them like the back of their hand are returning to these locations this year and noticing several changes, including submerged objects as well as changes to the waterways themselves. As an example, the Hawkesbury River, which is in Sydney's northwest, is one that underwent several major floods last year, which changed the geographical landscape of the region entirely. That includes widening of the riverbank, as well as several felled trees along the riverbank and submerged objects, including large concrete pylons, which has added heightened risk to swimmers and locals across the region. Now, authorities are urging people to remain extra vigilant this summer season and to make sure they stay away from alcohol if they are going to participate in water recreation activities. That's to prevent further loss of life and help people stay extra safe this summer season.
A warning for damaging winds has been issued for the top end, heralding more wild weather for the Northern Territory this week. Winds of up to 100 kilometres an hour are likely as vigorous monsoonal flow travels through the region. Warnings for isolated thunderstorms are in the Barkly region, and a fire weather warning for the Central Desert south of Alice Springs are also in place. Yesterday's Perth Cup had to be abandoned mid-race after one horse died and another was injured following an horrific fall. The two horses fell just 200 metres into the race, with mare Chili is Hot having to be euthanised at the track. The other horse, Dom de Chute, suffered minor injuries and finished the race without a rider. Both of the jockeys escaped with no injuries, and racing authorities have opened an investigation into the incident. Several new federal government assistance measures have come into force at the start of the new year. Australians will now pay up to 30% less for medicines on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, while many Centrelink payments will rise by about 6%. But as reporter Zalika Rismal explains, not everyone thinks the increases are enough amid the rising cost of living.
Now, as of the 1st of January, almost 1 million Australians will see their income support payments go up by around 6% in line with indexation. Now, it's not all Centrelink payments. In fact, the majority going up as of yesterday are those affecting young people, so people on youth allowance, on Oz Study, and also some carers as well. Now, many groups have welcomed this, but others, like the Council of Social Services, are saying that in real terms, this actually isn't a boost, that it's not enough to cover the soaring cost of living prices that we're seeing, and that people simply won't able to survive or be able to feed themselves and house themselves. I mean, we've seen inflation become a real issue in this past year. Food up by 9%, fruit and vegetables up by 17%, as well as petrol, rentals and electricity we're going to see go up even further this year as well. Now, we've heard from the Australian Council of Social Services today, and their response really is that the issue is around the base rates, that the base rates are so low that even this relatively significant increase won't make a dent for young people receiving these payments. Take a listen to what ACOS CEO Cassandra Goldie had to say earlier today.
It will mean that indexation will mean an increase of about $2 per day, and the rate will therefore be $40 a day, not $38 a day. And so we really need to put this in perspective. I mean, for people, young people who are relying on this income support to keep a roof over their head and feeding themselves, it is not enough. And as many know, we have for a long time now been urging the government to move to lift the base rates of these critical income support payments in the face of the cost of living crisis that everybody is talking about and many are experiencing. We've now got people on the lowest incomes who are, today facing the reality they cannot afford really the essentials of life at this time.
Now, the federal government has been quick to respond and point out that this increase is actually the largest in 25 years since 1998. But of course, the government had been calling when they were in opposition for a permanent increase to these payments. Now, that hasn't happened. The government has made reference to the budgetary pressures that they're experiencing, with the Social Services Minister, Amanda Wishworth, saying that it simply wouldn't be prudent after inheriting $1 trillion worth of debt to increase these payments. But ACOS is looking forward to that May budget, and we'll see this year what becomes of that.
Thousands of Brazilians have gathered in the capital to celebrate the inauguration of their new president. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has been sworn in to lead the country for a third time.
It's being hailed as a new dawn for Brazil. A sea of supporters lined the streets of the capital, Brasilia, to watch Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva take the reins of the nation for the third time.
I promise to keep, defend and fulfil the Constitution.
The new president has vowed to bring change after 4 years of rule by populist conservative leader Jair Bolsonaro. But the leftist leader faces an uphill battle to unite Brazil after just winning its tightest election in more than 3 decades.
The great building of law, sovereignty and development that this nation built has been systematically demolished in recent years. The rebuilding will guide all our efforts.
Lula's plans for Brazil stand in stark contrast to those of his predecessor. He's pledged to fight poverty, end deforestation in the Amazon, and pursue justice for the Bolsonaro government's lax response to the coronavirus pandemic. Lula's inauguration took place under heightened security amid fears of violence and calls for a coup from the far right. By putting on the presidential sash, Lula's promise to reunite a fractured nation begins in earnest. Isabella Bull, ABC News.
The International Court of Justice will provide advice to the United Nations on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory. Middle East correspondent Tom Joyner has more.
The UN General Assembly asked countries to decide whether the International Court of Justice should provide a legal opinion on Israel's occupation, the longest running in modern history. The motion passed 87 to 26, with more than 50 countries abstaining and much of the West opposing it, including the UK, US and Australia. Israel has already said that the outcome will have no bearing on its policies. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying afterwards that his country will not be bound by what he labelled a, quote, despicable decision. However, the timing does pose a test for the new Prime Minister, who was only sworn into office last week as head of the most right-wing government in Israel's history. That's because a central part of his election platform was expanding Israeli settlements inside the West Bank, which is Palestinian territory. Those settlements, which are home to hundreds of thousands of Israelis, are widely seen as a violation of international law. Now, for Palestinians, the settlements and the constant presence of Israeli soldiers in the West Bank makes life extraordinarily difficult. Israel's military controls nearly every aspect of daily life there. But in a video address, Mr. Netanyahu made the false claim that the land belonged to Israel.
Like all the hundreds of distorted decisions against Israel by the UN over the years, this despicable decision will not bind the Israeli government. The Jewish people are not occupiers on their own land.
Palestinians, on the other hand, have welcomed the vote as a victory for diplomacy. President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, said through a spokesman that the time has come for Israel to be held accountable for crimes against his people. Now, whatever the International Court of Justice decides, it can't compel Israel to do anything either way. Its rulings are not enforceable, but it could change international sentiment. It's expected to gather the opinions of dozens of countries before presenting its final advice to the UN in the coming months.
Fast-moving floodwaters have swamped parts of northern California after a powerful weather system brought heavy rain to the region. The downpour was triggered by a so-called atmospheric river, a weather phenomenon hundreds of kilometres long that carries water vapour across oceans from the tropics. The system dumped more than 13 centimetres of rain on San Francisco, with floodwaters submerging neighbourhood streets in the state's north. Hundreds of rescuers in southern Vietnam are working to free a boy stuck down a narrow concrete pipe. CCTV showed the 10-year-old and 3 friends walking in the construction site before he disappeared down the 35-metre hole 3 days ago. Emergency crews don't know how far down the child fell. They're pumping in oxygen and hope to pull the concrete pillar out with a crane. The boy's condition is said to be stable. Pope Francis has paid tribute to Benedict XVI at St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. The Pope described his predecessor as a faithful servant of the gospel and the church. The body of the former pontiff will lie in state before his funeral on Thursday.
They gathered at a Mass for peace at St. Peter's Basilica. This traditional start to the Catholic New Year was, of course, overshadowed by the passing of Benedict XVI. His successor talked of now entrusting the Pope Emeritus to the Holy Mother for his journey to God. Later, it was many thousands that poured into St. Peter's Square to see Pope Francis appear at a balcony and to hear a prayer for his predecessor.
Let us all join together with one heart and one soul in thanking God for this faithful servant of the gospel and the church.
The legacy of Pope Benedict for some people is complicated by the way he's viewed to have handled abuse scandals, particularly while he was Archbishop of Munich. How do you look back at that now?
On the one hand, we can say that also Pope Benedict, just as Archbishop of Munich, he was not so strong in these affairs. But on the other hand, we must say, also as Pope, during all his pastoral visits, one meeting was dedicated to persons who suffered by the church, also by sexual abuses.
Even those who worked with and knew the late Pope well acknowledge mistakes were made. But some of those who happened to have been visiting from far afield when the news broke feel honoured to be here now.
We did not know that he passed until we were actually here and we saw the lines, and my wife and I were very blessed because we did have the opportunity to see him here and have the New Year's Mass many years ago. So it was very, it touched us very personally.
So what are you going to take away from this experience?
How much he meant to everyone, how much he impacted everyone, what did they do for him, you know, seeing people cry and get all emotional, like, got me emotional as well.
Over the coming 3 days, the Pope Emeritus will lie in state for the masses who will want to pay tribute to him in person.
Demand for electric vehicles is surging, meaning buyers face high prices and long waits for cars. But there'll be more models coming into Australia from China, which is now the world's biggest maker of electric vehicles. And the cars from there are often more affordable.
Driving electric vehicles runs in the Wilcox family. Ian purchased a Tesla 3 years ago, and his son Oliver recently bought his own EV.
If we're really going to drive this change, we need young people like Oliver to get behind it.
Oliver does a lot of driving for work. He decided to buy a cheaper model made by Chinese manufacturer BYD.
For that savings of almost $20,000, it was definitely worth a risk, and it's been great.
Everything inside this vehicle has been designed from the ground up.
BYD is China's largest electric vehicle maker. In the next 12 months, it plans to expand in Australia.
We have committed to at least 2 models coming onto the Australian market every year.
More than 20% of all car sales in China are electric vehicles. That compares to nearly 3% in Australia, where motorists face higher prices and lagging infrastructure. While the uptake of EVs in Australia is slow, the market in China is booming. There are about 300 companies producing EVs there and about 4 million charging stations across the country. That's encouraging to Chinese consumers to jump on board. Locally made batteries and car components, subsidies and cheaper labour costs have helped drive down prices in China.
The Chinese car industry have been developed in the last 20-30 years with the help of the major car manufacturing.
As more charging stations are rolled out here, analysts say Australia's EV uptake is about to accelerate.
We're projecting that there will be probably a 30% increase in car sales in 2023.
A green transition that needs everyone to get into the driver's seat. Samuel Yang, ABC News.
An historic lighthouse on a remote headland on the central Queensland coast has lit the way for ships for more than 150 years. A group of dedicated volunteers is keeping that history alive, enjoying a peaceful escape from modern life in the process.
For most, living in a lighthouse is the stuff of fiction. But for Reg and Sandra Pugh, a Bustard Head lighthouse is their second home.
There's nothing quite like coming to a lighthouse to spend your time.
Once a year, the couple travels south from Gladstone for a month to look after the lighthouse.
We get lots of beautiful blue skies, and the sunsets and the sunrises, which I like to get up and enjoy, are just fantastic.
During the day, they show tourists around and maintain the grounds. At night, they play card games.
But when everyone goes, it is the isolation of the place that strikes home.
Located on a remote headland near Agnes Water in central Queensland, Bustard Head was built in 1868. For more than a century, the light inside this tower had to be manually lit every night. That was until the 1980s, when it was automated. The area was abandoned, left to ruin. But more than 20 years later, volunteers stepped in to restore the site. Now it's a popular tourist destination, with the only way to get there, a Vietnam War-era amphibious vehicle.
We remove all of the rubbish that the lighthouse keepers and their caretakers produce. We bring them food when they need it. They usually come self-sufficient.
I love that we're part of preserving history.
A history that shines on. Toby Loftus, ABC News, Bustard Head.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. The federal government says China needs to be more transparent with the international community about the impact of COVID after introducing new testing requirements for travellers coming into Australia. All arrivals from China will need to provide a negative test before entering Australia from midnight on Thursday. It comes after the country lifted its strict zero COVID policy. Royal Lifesaving Australia is urging swimmers to be extra cautious around waterways after a number of drownings. More than half of this summer's drownings have occurred away from the beach, and the body of another swimmer was found in Victoria's Alpine region this morning. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has been sworn in as the new president of Brazil, the third time he's held the country's highest office. Hundreds of thousands of people have gathered in the capital, Brasilia, for the inauguration. President Lula has promised to rebuild the country from what he called the terrible ruins that he's inherited from outgoing leader Jair Bolsonaro. Australia will be without its top-ranked women's tennis player, Tomljanovic, for tonight's United Cup against Spain in Sydney. Tomljanovic has officially withdrawn from the team's event with a knee injury. Australia lost its first tie to Great Britain, which last night clinched top spot in Group D with a 3-1 win over Spain. Several new federal government assistance measures have come into force at the start of the new year. Australians will now pay up to 30% less for medicines on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, while many Centrelink payments will rise by about 6%. While many have welcomed the new measures, the head of the Australian Council of Social Services, Cassandra Goldie, says it's not enough.
We've got big choices to make as a country, and the Treasurer himself is saying we need to have a healthy debate about the overall revenue base that Australia needs to invest in these critical essential services like aged care, like childcare, affordable and social housing and income supports. The country has to decide, are we going to deliver eye-watering tax cuts? As you know, those stage 3 tax cuts are still in the books and will come in next year and will cost the bottom line of that budget about 19 billion per annum. And we're saying, well, we can't even rethink that policy, but instead what we'll do is fix these base rates of income support so that we know over 3 million people are now still facing poverty, reality. They're not being able to feed themselves. We've got a report out in the last couple of days saying that we've now got about 2 million households that are skipping meals, going without food, and a 60% increase in demand for food relief. So we have a 6% increase to indexation for youth allowance, and that's affecting about 290 million of our young people, and they are facing nationally increases in rent. 18%, those rents have gone up, energy bills up by 20%, and food up by 9%. And so this is the reality of people on the lowest incomes, their budget position. So we do think that we have to have a responsible approach to the federal budget, and we are urging the government to make the right choice going into this May budget and to lift the base rates of job seeker and youth allowance so that people can at least afford to feed themselves and keep themselves housed.
Police say the body of a man who drowned while swimming in Lake Eildon, northeast of Melbourne yesterday, has been found. It's one of 24 drownings so far this summer, with the majority of those being in inland waterways, including rivers, dams and lakes. RJ Houston is the National Aquatic Manager for Royal Lifesaving Australia and joins me now. Good afternoon, welcome to the program. What's the state of play right now?
Thanks for having me, Dan. Yeah, look, unfortunately there's been 24 drownings so far this summer, 80% of those have been male and 54% of those have been in inland waterways. We know that the leading activity prior to drowning has actually been boating and watercraft use, followed by swimming and recreating. Unfortunately, there's a few key risk factors that we know are at play sometimes with these drownings. Things like alcohol consumption. 25% of drownings last year involved alcohol consumption. We also know that not wearing a life jacket when boating or fishing is a key risk factor. And of course, failure to supervise children. It's really important that we keep watch of children around waterways, in and around water. Keep children under the age of 5 within arm's reach, and children under the age of 10 constantly supervised.
So the key advice seems to be making sure that children are safe, monitoring the conditions, and clearly not having any alcohol when you're around those waterways.
Yeah, look, absolutely. It's really important, you know, if you're out with a group of people, that you always designate someone to supervise children. But unfortunately, the key demographic of people, you know, our key demographic of people that are drowning are sort of blokes like me, and unfortunately, blokes aren't getting the message. You know, you need to make the right call around water. You need to look after your mates around water. Lay off the beers until you're back on dry land, and all swimming and water activity is ceased for the day. And of course, knowing the conditions, avoid going alone. Swimming at patrolled locations, really important. And definitely avoiding the alcohol and supervising those children.
And controlled locations is a really key point there, and we're seeing a vision here of flagged beaches. However, as you touched on, in the recent year, 54% of those that have died have been in inland waterways, haven't they?
Yeah, look, inland waterways have been the leading location for drowning, going on about 10 years now. Like over the last year as well, they've been the leading location. So we're talking about rivers, creeks and lakes, sometimes dams as well. But this summer so far, 54% of all the drownings this summer have been at inland waterways. And so we know that a lot of Australians go to inland waterways, particularly in regional areas. So there's a bit of a misconception that everyone goes to the beach when it's hot, but actually people go to rivers, creeks, lakes, dams, and enjoy some really beautiful natural environments. But the difference there between those environments and beaches is that they're not lifeguarded. There are no patrols there in most cases. So we would really encourage families and people swimming and recreating to go to lifeguarded environments. So in those regional areas, there's probably a public pool nearby with lifeguards, and which is a controlled environment. So go there first, particularly if you're a family and you have kids. And if you are going to some of these really beautiful waterways and swimming holes that we have, avoid the silly risk-taking behaviour. We see a lot of cliff jumping, those types of activities, people slipping off of uneven banks. We see people getting swept away in currents, swimming in flooded areas where the conditions have changed. Maybe there's erosion or submerged hazards floating through the waterways. So avoid swimming in those hazardous locations, and avoid doing the hazardous activities if you are swimming in some of those beautiful inland swimming locations.
And as well as avoiding that risky behaviour, I wonder if part of it is understanding the waterways that you're in and what the circumstances are there. Any hazards, particularly if there are like sand that's very close to the water's edge or that sort of thing.
Yeah, particularly with all the water flowing through those waterways after all the rains that we've had over the last couple of years, the waterways themselves change, particularly rivers. So with that extra water flowing through, the sandbank may have moved, the submerged objects that have floated through, debris may have moved. So the conditions that you might be used to at your favourite swimming hole, if you're used to going camping on the river, for example, may have changed since the last time you've been there. And also the banks may have eroded as well underneath the surface. So if you're walking near the edge as well, that you've just got to be really careful to particularly keep poor non-swimmers like children and the vulnerable away from the edges as well if you're around those environments.
RJ, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. RJ Houston is the National Aquatic Manager for Royal Lifesaving Australia.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Tasmanian Police is running its biggest ever recruitment drive in the hopes of attracting more people into the force. It's targeting young Tasmanians and more diverse recruits amid broader workforce shortages.
These are Tasmania's newest police officers. They've graduated after 8 months training at the Police Academy in Rokeby.
It's an amazing feeling, trying to hold back the tears.
A week into the job in Hobart, Constable Skye Eastley is excited for her future in the force.
And I wanted something that is, you never know what you're going to turn up to do at work each day, and that team environment that comes alongside with policing.
I don't think there's a better career.
Tasmania Police is undertaking its most significant marketing campaign as it tries to boost its ranks in line with government targets. The ads show young people what a policing career could look like.
For us to be an employer of choice, we need to put ourselves forward and show what we have to offer to attract people to Tasmania Police.
Police forces around the country have been struggling to find recruits, partly because of the nation's low unemployment rate. It's meant that some recruit courses have had to be run with low numbers or even cancelled. The public perception of policing throughout the pandemic could also be having an impact.
We're coming out of a period of the last couple of years in relation to some enforcement activities around COVID, and whether that has had an impact on, I guess, the image of policing.
Punch out, cover your threat. Vanessa Whelan has been with Tasmania Police for 20 years and says the diversity has improved, with women now making up more than a third of the workforce.
It gives a lot of women more confidence in their skill sets to sort of further themselves in their policing career, because they don't feel like a minority, and we all support each other.
Aiming for a fulfilling career, Selena Ross, ABC News.
The United Nations has voted to refer Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory to the International Court of Justice. The move comes amid warnings of tensions in West Bank settlements after the country's new far-right cabinet was sworn in last week. Joining me now to discuss these developments is ANU Middle East expert, former Australian ambassador to Lebanon, Ian Palmer. Good afternoon. Thank you for your company.
Good afternoon.
Ian, this is not the first time that there's been a referral to the court. In fact, it's not even the first time that the court has made a determination on this very question. Does it matter now? Is it still relevant?
Well, it's relevant in a symbolic way. It won't make any difference on the ground. The Israeli government has already said it will ignore any advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice will uphold international law, but it has no way of enforcing it. And that's the issue. And no country is going to take on Israel directly on this. Interestingly, with the vote itself, Israel's allies in the Abraham Accords actually voted to support the Palestinians, which indicates that it's still an issue of some friction in the region itself, despite the fact that Israel is now able to reach out to far more Arab countries in the past year than in the past few years than it originally could when it was created.
Well, I wanted to get your observations as someone who has worked and is still working very much around the region of what those numbers said to you, particularly that seemingly very high number of abstentions.
Well, what it means is that countries like what you might call relatively moderate countries have actually decided to abstain. Many countries around the world support the Palestinian perspective, but they're not prepared to go so far as to vote in favour of a resolution on these lines. In the General Assembly, though, which one must note is not the Security Council, in the General Assembly, resolutions are not binding in the way that Security Council resolutions are. So many of them simply have what you might call a moral effect, in much the same way as resolutions that have been passed in the past year on Ukraine, which have been overwhelmingly against Russia's invasion, have made no difference to Russia and no difference whatsoever to the situation on the ground. It is very symbolic, and it's something that Israel will will protest against, but it will not do anything to implement any advisory opinion of the Court of Justice.
There's also, of course, the veto power within the Security Council, which is a whole another discussion we could have. Palestinian officials, as you would expect, have hailed the vote as a victory, while despicable is how the Israeli Prime Minister described it. At the very start, Ian, you mentioned the symbolism of this move. What do you think the impact of that could be around the region and more broadly around the world?
Well, I'm not sure it'll make that much difference overall. looking back to 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled that the security barrier that Israel has built, separating it from elements of the West Bank and also through East Jerusalem, was illegal under the Geneva Convention. Now, there was some note taken of that, but it made no difference on the ground, and no one is going to seek to enforce such a ruling. So, although it will be a symbolic victory for the Palestinians, and symbolic also in the sense that it comes at about the time of the 58th anniversary of the founding of Fatah, the main militant opposition group to Israel, and also, of course, symbolic in the sense of at the time of the founding of the new Israeli government, a very right-wing government, which is likely to take steps in the West Bank that will cause a lot of anger in the Middle East overall. But although there will be anger, they won't be able to do anything about it, and Israel would ignore it.
You've taken me to my next question and final question, Ian, and that is that this new cabinet has been described as right-wing. What do you expect to materialise from this new government?
Well, it will be very right-wing and probably provocative. The police minister, Ben-Gvir, has already made clear that he proposes to make a visit to the Temple Mount, which is sacred both to Jewish Israelis and to Arab Israelis, but also to Arabs of the Muslim faith all around in other countries. And you may recall that in 2000, the now deceased but former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made a visit to the Temple Mount, and that actually set off a 5-year intifada, which was a 5-year series of rolling strikes and violent actions by Palestinians against Israelis. It eventually petered out. I might add, I don't think there's likely to be another intifada. It's simply too hard on the Palestinians, and Israelis are very good at putting it down. But it will add to the tensions in the area, and the tensions will continue to rise as long as this right-wing government is in power.
Well, Ian, thank you. We're very grateful for your insights. A Middle East specialist at ANU Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies and a former Australian ambassador to Lebanon. Appreciated.
Thank you.
One of the legendary Pointer Sisters singing group has died in the United States. Anita Pointer was 74. The Grammy-winning Pointer Sisters released a string of pop, country and R&B hits in the 1970s and 80s.
Thanks to a diverse blend of rhythm and blues, funk and soul, the Pointer Sisters were responsible for songs that are still lighting up dance floors decades after they were first performed. And making an impact on wider popular culture too. It was the 1973 song Yes We Can, with its Anita-led vocals calling for togetherness during a time of racial unrest in the US that catapulted the group into the mainstream. Originally from Oakland in California, Anita Pointer and her sisters went on to win Grammy Awards and become prominent features in the American music charts. Still performing into her late 60s, Anita suffered personal tragedy during her life, losing her only child, Jada Pointer, to cancer in 2003. The singer went on to raise her granddaughter. She's died aged 74, surrounded by her family in California, who've said that heaven is a more loving, beautiful place with Anita there. And they're comforted in knowing that she's now with her daughter and her sisters June and Bonnie, and at peace.
With power bills and the cost of living soaring, a Queensland couple is urging others to live off-grid. One expert says trust in renewables has risen, but there are calls for more affordable and sustainable energy storage solutions.
Living off the electricity grid has been Cheryl and Trevor's way of life for 17 years.
We've got plenty of power, which we can run microwaves, toasters, jugs, air fryers, air compressors, welding machines.
The couple lives on Curtis Island off the central Queensland coast, where there's no mains power or water.
I've had solar on this house ever since I built it, and we finished the house in 1989.
Since then, the price of solar energy systems has plummeted while electricity prices have skyrocketed.
They've come down in price a hell of a lot.
When we look at solar installation 10 years ago, the consumer paid approximately $2.40 per watt. And this cost came down to around or under $1 per watt.
Experts say trust in the technology is high, with about 3 million or more than 30% of Australian households using solar.
Once you get the solar on, there's no extra cost whatsoever.
For traditional energy providers, renewables cause uncertainty in a grid designed for one-way flow to the consumer.
Energy storage solutions need to become more affordable.
Residents here on Curtis Island used to rely on kerosene and diesel generators to power their homes. But as solar has become more affordable and accessible, it's now the energy source of choice.
I think it's the way of the future. I can't wait to go off-grid.
An island paradise powered by the sun. Erin Semler, ABC News, Curtis Island.
Time for sport now, and Catherine Murphy joins me. Let's start with tennis, and Great Britain has essentially ended Australia's hopes of winning the inaugural United Cup.
Yes, hello to you, Dan, and Happy New Year. They have indeed, and because of a man called Dan, a great name, I think you'll agree, Dan Evans with a win. Now, he's actually the favourite player of Ros Childs. Now, I know she's on holiday right now, but I just want to say shout out to Ros, the excitement right now for her. She won't be able to peel her eyes off the TV, even though she's not at work. He had a win over Albert Ramos Vinulas. That means that Great Britain completed a win over Spain after they also beat Australia. Now, Australia were, of course, without Ajla Tomljanovic, who you can see on screen, and Nick Kyrgios, who you saw just before, both ruled out due to injury. However, we can't place too much emphasis on that because Great Britain were without Emma Raducanu, their US Open champion. She's chosen to play in Auckland. So all teams, Dan, or without a certain number of players, but it's been quite the year for Dan Evans getting that win, and Cameron Norrie, who of course defeated Alex de Minaur when they played Australia and also defeated Rafael Nadal.
I reckon Ros will still be watching to keep an eye on you and I, Kath, so she'll be happy to hear that news.
She will. She'll be beside herself with excitement. Just thoughts and prayers with Ros Childs right now. She must be having some time of it watching her favourite.
Yeah, I hope she's having a good break. Hey, Australia take on Spain today, and despite the fact they won't win the competition, there's a tantalising match to look forward to tonight.
There is indeed. Alex de Minaur will take on Rafael Nadal. Now, this would have been Nick Kyrgios versus Rafael Nadal, but this is such an important matchup for the Aussie. He lost to Cameron Norrie, as did Rafael Nadal, so neither of them have had a great start to the year. They'll both be hoping they can get a win on the board, because despite the fact they can't win the group, we know that Great Britain have already unassailably got that lead in Group D. They finished top. They will play against the winners of Group C, by the way, Dan. Group C involves America, who are taking on Germany right now, and Taylor Fritz has taken the first set. So it looks like it will be Great Britain versus the US. A long way to go in that US versus Germany tie. However, there is the possibility, and I'm almost worried to talk about this, Dan, because my maths aren't good mid-year when I'm peaking, never mind on January 2nd, but I'm just going to put it out there. So the way this tournament works is the winner of each city goes through to the semi-finals. That's the winner of Sydney, Perth and Brisbane. But then there's another spot for the next best performing team. Now, Australia lost 3-2 to Great Britain. You would think if they defeat Spain 5-0 in that tie, and that is no easy feat with Rafael Nadal being on the team and all that, it's quite unlikely. Surely they would come into those mathematical propositions of maybe becoming the fourth team. But like I said, Dan, get a mathematician in if you really want to know if that's possible.
You lost me when you started talking about mathematics, but I'll take your word for it. Meanwhile, there are plenty of Aussies in action at the Adelaide International today, so what's the latest there?
OK, plenty of Aussies in action. Later this afternoon, Jordan Thompson will take to the court. We'll see Thanasi Kokonakis take to the court later tonight. He won the Adelaide International last year. He won the second tournament, so technically he's the defending champion next week. Again, that's probably not making sense right now, Dan. So much tennis going on. Also, Alexei Popyrin will be in action, but Chris O'Connell is taking on Miomir Kecmanovic right now, and it hasn't started well. In fact, he was broken in the first game and went on to lose that first set 6-4, but plenty of Aussies to look forward to today. But the match we'll all have our eyes on is absolutely Rafael Nadal taking on Alex de Minaur. Here is hoping Alex de Minaur can have a good night tonight. The only issue with Alex de Minaur is he doesn't have a second gear. He's got injured before in tournaments leading up to the Australian Open just because of his sheer grit and determination and want to win every time he hits the court. Hopefully they both get through it healthy as well.
Yeah, indeed. And finally, in cricket, the Brisbane Heat has some standout performances in their win over the Sydney Sixers last night.
They certainly did, Dan, and these are names that you would not expect to be the standout performers. But yes, the Brisbane Heat with a 15-run victory over the Sydney Sixers in that Big Bash League match at the Gabba, and local replacement player Josh Brown smashed 62 runs off just 23 balls in what was just his second ever BBL game. Then Nathan McSweeney, he top scored with 84 runs as the Heat posted a team record 5 for 224. So a great win for them and great to see local players impress.
Catherine Murphy, good to have you along. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
A quick look at the national weather now. Brisbane, partly cloudy, mostly sunny for Sydney, partly cloudy in Canberra. Melbourne, a few storms before a cool change this afternoon. Hobart, a shower or two and a possible storm. Sunny in Perth and Adelaide, and Darwin, showers. Thousands of people have braved near-freezing water, jumping into the North Sea as part of an annual New Year's tradition in the Netherlands. It was just 11 degrees Celsius at this beach and 7 degrees in the water, ensuring a speedy wake-up for the first morning of 2023. Across the country, around 50,000 people joined in the tradition to ring in the new year. And what a way to do it. It looks absolutely freezing. Better than a cup of coffee. Well, that's ABC News for now, and a reminder that you can keep up to date on all the latest news across all your devices at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Dan Borscher. Thanks for your company.